Hello, good morning and good evening to our dear friends across the globe. Welcome to the webinar today. I'm Sharon Kell. I'm trained as an internist in geriatrician with an MPH in epidemiology. I studied at the University of Alabama and was there for 7 years as an assistant professor of medicine, practicing medicine, teaching and conducting research. And after that, I joined the pharmaceutical industry, which I've been in now for over 23 years. I've held positions at Novartis in Med Affairs, Johnson & Johnson in Med Affairs and clinical R&D, at Impacts as VP R&D, Med Affairs and Pharmacovigilance, at Amneal as VP Drug Safety, at Provention as SVP and Clinical Development. I'm now currently consulting. So, the webinar today is RMPs and REMS, Comprehending the Inscrutable. The paradigm continues to change in drug development, which always mandates strengthening of the procedures for drug safety management. And this requires not only a sound knowledge of risk, but a foolproof plan to mitigate these risks as well. So in this webinar today, Sanjeev Miglani and Mugdha Chopra, who are co-founders and directors of Awenza Life Sciences, will talk in detail about the management of RMPs and REMS. But at this onset, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping topics. Please post your questions during the webinar, and we appreciate them. We'll do our best to address your questions at the end. And in case we're not able to answer the questions due to time constraints, we'll respond via email. The webinar itself will be available for download on demand after a couple days. So at this time, I'm going to hand the floor over to Sanjeev and Mugdha, who are going to start today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Sharon. So before we start with the presentation today, I would like to quickly introduce Dr. Sanjeev. So Dr. Sanjeev Miglani is the founder and director of Awenza Life Sciences. He's an MD in internal medicine and has over 20 years of experience in the field of medicine, pharmacovigilance, and clinical research. In his last assignment, he was the Vice President of Safety and Medical Affairs at APSR. Just before joining APSR, Sanjeev was the Vice President for Pharmacovigilance and Medical Writing at Accenture. And before joining Accenture, Sanjeev was the Chief Operating Officer and Scientific Director of CIDP Biotech. Prior to CIDP, Sanjeev was the Director of Medical Affairs at CliniRx. And before CliniRx, he worked with Ranbaxy as a Senior Manager in the Department of Medical Affairs and Pharmacovigilance. He has also worked as a senior resident in cardiology and medical medicine department in some of the prestigious hospitals of New Delhi. Sanjeev is a lifetime member of a fellow of Indian Association of Clinical Medicine, and he has numerous publications in medical journals and books to his credit too. From now, Sanjeev, I'll hand over to you to start off with your presentation.
Thanks, Mugdha. So in today's presentation, I'll be talking about the RMP, the EU RMP primarily, and the different parts of risk management plan. Then Dr. Mugdha will talk about risk evaluation mitigation strategies from the US perspective, the different elements of REMS, and she'll pick up some examples and challenges that we sometimes face in REMS. All right. Maybe just before I start talking about the risk management plan, I think it's very important to know that whenever any regulatory authority approves any medicinal product, they basically have that assumption that, and of course it's based on the concrete investigation and everything, that yes, benefits outweigh the risk. And once they have that confidence, only then the medicinal products get approved. So the overall aim of risk management is to ensure that benefits definitely outweigh the risk, and the primary aim and the focus of the risk management plan remains that of appropriate risk planning or risk management planning throughout the medicinal product life cycle. And the risk management system is proportionate to the identified risk and the potential risk of the medicinal product. So the risk management plan is a dynamic document that should be updated throughout the life cycle of the product. And practically, a risk management plan is having three main elements. First is the identification or the characterization of the safety profile of the medicinal product, which is basically the safety specification, which includes important identified and important potential risks. The second element is the planning of the pharmacovigilance activities to characterize and quantify clinically relevant risks and to identify new adverse reactions. So that's basically the pharmacovigilance plan. And the third element is the risk minimization plan, which is the planning and implementation of risk minimization measures, including the evaluation of the effectiveness of these activities. So with the exception of some patient registries, it is expected that over time, the additional pharmacovigilance activities in the risk management plan will be completed and thus removed from the RMP. So the risk management plan is required to be updated at two major milestones. One is at the time of 5-year renewal, and second is in the time period when the first PSUR following the first 5-year renewal is due for submission. And practically that is 8 to 9 years following the grant of the marketing authorization, at the time when the assessment of the initial marketing authorization application for generic product for the active substance starts. Now, there could be some other scenarios also where when the risk management plan can be updated. First is at the request of the regulatory agency or a competent authority in a member state when there is a concern about a risk affecting the risk-benefit balance. And second is when there is an application involving a change to the existing marketing authorization, when the data included leads to a change in the list of safety concern, or when a new additional pharmacovigilance activity or a risk minimization activity is needed or is proposed to be removed. So from EU perspective, and in fact, like this module or this kind of structure of RMP would be typically followed in most of the other countries also. But generally, like what happens is that sometimes the pharmaceutical companies may have a global RMP or a core RMP where they might have all the elements, and then based on a specific country requirement, like say in Australia, if there is a specific country requirement or an access, so that can be added to the global or the core RMP. But generally, like in most of these global RMP, all the elements of the EU are always standardized, so they are there. But depending on the country-specific requirement, like say in Philippines, there might be a specific requirement, or in Australia, there is a specific requirement for an access, so that can be added to the core RMP. So the different parts of RMPs include Part 1 RMP, which is product overview. The second part is the major part of RMP, which is the safety specification, which has different kind of modules. Then there is a PV plan, which is Part 3. After that, there is a plan for post-authorization efficacy study, which is Part 4 of the RMP. There is a Part 5 for risk minimization measures, which include both routine and additional risk minimization. And this is followed by a summary of the risk management plan, which is Part 6. And then there are annexes in the RMP. So the first part of the RMP is practically the product overview. And before we go to the product overview, maybe I like to emphasize on this important part, which is the requirement for different kind of applications. So, and in fact, this is a requirement slide, which is taken exactly from GP module 5. So if you look into this particular slide, you would see that there are different type of requirement for different kind of application. So obviously, if there is an innovator product, which is a full marketing authorization application, so all the different parts of the RMPs are required. And this is followed by, say, generic product, wherein the requirement for epidemiology or different parts of safety specification modules may not be required. But if there is no RMP that is existing for the original product, or maybe the safety profile is not mentioned in the CMDH website, I'm sure like many of you who are already working on the RMPs, so you would be referring to the CMDH website for the generic products especially. So if the safety concerns are already mentioned in the CMDH website, so obviously then we don't need to mention even section 7. So just section 8, which is summary of the some safety concerns which are identified as important identified or important potential or the missing information. So only that is required to be populated in the safety specification module, and then the rest of the sections are anyway required to be populated. But yes, if there is no original product that does not have any RMP, or the safety concerns are not there in the CMDH site, so of course then this section has to be populated based on the data that the pharmaceutical company may have. Similarly, like there are some other scenarios, and the GEP module clearly mentions which all safety specification section modules have to be captured in the RMP, and which all can be avoided or may not be required based on the type of application. So coming to the different parts of RMP, the first part of the RMP is the product overview, and this product overview should provide the administrative information on the risk management plan and an overview of the product. Well, this should have the active substance, the pharmacotherapeutic code, which is anatomic therapeutic chemical classification, the name of the marketing authorization applicant, and it should also mention about the type of procedure through which the product has been approved, like the mutual recognition or decentralized. The section on product overview should also have the authorization procedure along with the invented name, a brief description of the product, including the chemical class, the summary of mode of action, and important information about its composition. This section is then followed by part 2, which is safety specification. And the purpose of the safety specification is to provide a kind of a adequate or detailed discussion on the safety profile of the medicinal product. It should include a summary of the important identified risk and the important potential risk and the missing information. So I'll clarify what is important identified risk and important potential risk. So important identified is basically a kind of a risk which is established. So generally you would see that important identified risk is something which is already mentioned in the PI or the summary of product characteristics as listed adverse drug reaction, or they may be a part of the established contraindication or warning where we know that, okay, this particular thing is known to happen in a particular patient population. And generally these kind of risks, when we say important identified, they are serious. They are the ones which can cause public health threat. So that's why they're called important identified risk. Similarly, when we say a product has an important potential risk, so that typically means that the causal association with that product of that event has not been established concretely, but obviously that is under monitoring. So that signal is being monitored, but there is always a possibility that this might be having a causal association. So that's why that signal is monitored. Say if some preclinical data shows that some drug is causing hepatotoxicity, but no particular data is there in the human population that could indicate that. Maybe because in the preclinical population that was seen at a higher dose, but not in the normal dose. But then there is still a kind of a risk that this particular event can happen. Similarly, there can be scenarios where we think that, okay, based on the mechanism of action, we could anticipate something, but in the human data, still that particular serious event has not been observed. So that's why we keep on monitoring those kind of events, and they are considered as important potential risks. The safety specification should also address the populations potentially at risk and any outstanding safety questions that warrant further investigation. And the safety specification forms the basis of the PV plan and the risk minimization plan. So as we were discussing earlier, the slide that I had shown, which was basically taken from the GEP module, so that had different modules of the safety specification, and it is basically starting from the epidemiology to the non-clinical data to the clinical trial exposure. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not that for all kind of RMPs, all of these modules are required. Of course, when it comes to any innovator product or any full marketing authorization application, it goes without saying that all the parts of RMPs, including all the safety specification modules, are required to be captured. But there would be scenarios where the specific safety specification modules may not be required, like in generic products, they may not be required. It's just the summary of safety concerns that are required to be populated. And then there are some other scenarios, like in biosimilars, you may not need the epidemiology, but you still need other safety specification modules. So in the module S1, which is the part second, safety specification part 1, so we have to provide the epidemiology of the indication and the target population. We have to also specifically sometimes mention about the country specific data whenever we are working on a particular RMP for a specific country. Like say, if we are working on a particular RMP which is required for any country like Philippines, or maybe any country, say Canada, or any other specific location. So their regulatory authorities might expect that for those particular actions, we would need to give the country specific data also, apart from the global data. Then in module section 2 of the safety specification, we have to provide a high level summary of the non-clinical data, which should include things like toxicity or any key issues coming from the repeat dose toxicity or reproductive development toxicity or genotoxicity. This module should also talk about the safety pharmacology, say if that drug is having any impact on the QT interval prolongation, or it is causing any kind of toxicity, could be any target organ toxicity. So we have to provide that particular data. And of course, this has to come from the non-clinical department. So as we were discussing in one of our earlier webinars, like in DSURs, we need to basically have a kickoff meeting where we define the stakeholders. So even for RMP also, it is a similar model that people have to follow, because there would be data coming from different stakeholders. Say non-clinical data would be coming from the non-clinical or the toxicology department of the company. Similarly, the exposure data, which is module S3, so that would come typically from the clinical operation department. So similarly, there are other data points. So based on the owners of those particular verticals, so they have to provide the data, and that's why it's very important that this is handled in a kind of a teamwork manner, where all the stakeholders who are defined, they should provide the data. So the clinical trial exposure data typically can be provided in the form of table or any kind of a description, and the data can be provided in the form of age and gender, indication, dose, other stratifications can be provided if that provides some meaningful information. Then we have to also provide the populations which have not been studied in clinical trials. So there are scenarios where we may not randomize patients who are, say, more than 60, or sometimes we may not randomize the patients who are less than 18, and only adult population is randomized, just to ensure that the homogeneous population is there. So whenever we do not enroll any specific patient population, or maybe we are not enrolling any patient population due to some safety issue, so we have to mention that in S4 module. Then we have to talk about post-authorization experience in S5, which is the data for any kind of I mean, like the post-authorization experience could be from the other countries, or if there is any kind of indication which is in addition to the existing indication for which the drug is given. So we have to provide that kind of information also in this particular module. And there is a module S6, which is additional EU requirement for the safety specification, and the data like the misuse or the illegal purpose use, or if there is a medication error. So those kind of extra information should be provided in module S6. And then module S7 is just the important identified and the potential risk. When we say plain identified and potential, so it could also include those kind of risks which may not be important, but they could be mentioned, like say non-serious events also, which may not be important identified. They can also be captured in this S7 module. And then we have to summarize the safety concern, and summary of the safety concerns include everything which is important identified, important potential, or it could be missing information. The PV plan, which is part 3, is a very important part of risk management plan, and it provides a structured plan for the investigation of whether a potential risk is confirmed as an identified risk or refuted. This plan also provides a strategy for further characterization of safety concerns, including severity, frequency, and risk factor. The PV plan also provides a strategy for how missing information will be sought, and how the effectiveness of risk minimization measures are measured. So it does not basically kind of include actions which are intended to reduce, prevent, or mitigate risk, because they are separately mentioned in RMP Part 5, which I'll be talking subsequently. And the PV plan should focus on the safety concerns summarized in the RMP module section 8 of the safety specification, and it should be basically proportionate to the benefits and risk of the product. So in the PV plan, practically there are two main important elements: the routine PV activities and the additional PV activity. The routine PV activities are primarily the things which are routinely done in any PV department, which is like, say, when we do the case processing or when we are doing the signal analysis. So all of that routine PV activities which are to be done are coming under routine PV activities as a part of the PV plan. And even if there are some specific questionnaires which are developed sometime as a part of the routine PV activities just to get some additional data, so it's not counted as an additional PV activity. Even collecting the data through some adverse reaction follow-up questionnaire, so they also are a part of the routine PV activity. And then there are some additional PV activities which are required to be done. So they can be done in multiple forms. The clinical trials which are done, which could be randomized CT or PKPD studies. So all of these studies, whether they're interventional or non-interventional. So if in a particular trial is done to identify some safety concern, or basically if you're trying to evaluate some data, say if you know that a drug has a potential to cause prolonged QT, and if a clinical trial is being done to evaluate that. So all of these studies which are kind of done to further evaluate a safety concern, so they become a part of additional PV activities. Or if there is a medication error and some drug utilization study is done to understand the pattern of that drug utilization, so these studies are also considered to be part of additional PV activities. And then of course there can be additional active surveillance, which could be intensive monitoring activities or prescription event monitoring or registry. So all of them are practically a part of additional PV activities, and the idea is to evaluate the specific safety concerns in that particular population. The part 4 is the plan for the post-authorization efficacy study, and the RMP for this part should include a list of all the post-authorization efficacy studies which are imposed as the condition to the marketing authorization, or when included as specific obligations in the context of a conditional marketing authorization or a marketing authorization under exceptional circumstances. And if no such study is required as per GP module 5, so this section can remain empty. So the part 5, which is the next part of the RMP, is for the routine, for the risk minimization measure, which of course is having two elements, routine and additional risk minimization. So this particular part of the RMP needs to provide all the details of the risk minimization measures, which will be taken to reduce the risk associated with any safety concern, which could be any important identified or important potential risk. And for any active substance which are where there are individual products with substantially different indications or target population, it may be appropriate to have a risk minimization plan specific to each product, like the products where the indication lie in different medical specialties and have different safety concerns associated, or products where risks are differing according to target population, or the products where there is different legal status applicable for the supply of medicinal product to the patient. So that's how the section has to be populated. And of course, the risk minimization measures have to be categorized into two parts. One is the routine risk minimization, and the other is the additional risk minimization. So anything which is documented as a safety section in SMPC or the summary of product characteristics, so that is considered to be a routine risk minimization measure. Like if we are documenting something in the form of adverse reactions or contraindications or warning, so they all are considered to be routine risk minimization. Similarly, if you're capturing the information in product information leaflet, or say there's even a pack size, so even the pack size is basically considered like documentation of how we are putting the medicines in the pack. So every pack size is specifically authorized for a medicinal product, planning the number of dosage units within each pack, and the range of the pack size available can be considered a form of routine risk minimization activity. So sometimes the physicians would be able to figure out that, okay, this particular pack has to be prescribed not more than a particular number, because otherwise there can be safety concerns. So there can be limitations also provided in the pack size, so that there is no misuse of the medication, and patient should be just going as per the prescription. The other is the legal status also is a part of the routine risk minimization. So controlling the conditions under which a medicinal product may be made available can reduce the risk associated with its use or misuse. So the marketing authorization must include the details of any conditions or restrictions which could be imposed on the or the use of the medicinal product, including the conditions which a medicinal product may be made available to the patient. So there are some medications which are only to be given, say, in some hospital settings, or if there are some special medical prescriptions, say for narcotics or psychotropic substances, or if there is a potential for addiction. So the physicians have to be very careful about that. So that's why, based on the standard data about the legal status of the medicine, they all are considered to be a part of the routine risk minimization measure. The idea is to prevent any kind of important identified or potential risk associated with these kind of products. The next is the additional risk minimization measures, which can be implemented, and they can be implemented in various manners. Many of you would be knowing about potential teratogenic drug like isotretinoin. So if there are some health care professional letter or educational material prepared for any kind of risk, any kind of drug which is having important safety concern, so all of these additional measures in the form of healthcare professional educational program, or pharmacist guide to dispensing or prescribing, or any specific training program for physicians or pharmacists. So all of them are considered to be a part of additional risk minimization measures. So similarly, if there is a patient educational program, which could be in the form of alert card or reminder card, or patient information brochure or booklet, or even the controlled access program, say the famous pregnancy prevention program, which is applicable for isotretinoin, wherein there are mandates to ensure that even the pharmacist is registered, or physician is also registered, and only they can dispense a particular number of medication tablets to the patients, or some particular tests have to be done, like say in isotretinoin, the physicians have to ensure that the UPT is negative before the drug is given to the patient. So idea is to ensure that the pregnancy should not happen in such patients. And of course, if that happens, there could be additional risk minimization measures that can be implemented to ensure that the risks are minimized to all extent. So all of these come under the category of additional risk minimization measures. Part 6 is the section which is kind of covering the summary of the risk management plan. And practically, this particular section has to be very clear. It has to be in a kind of a plain language, not having any technical jargons, because this is mainly for the public in a way, and it has to be in fact publicly available. Part 6 of the RMP shall be provided by the marketing authorization holder for medicinal products which have an RMP, regardless of whether they are centrally or nationally authorized in the EU, and it should be updated when important changes are introduced into the full RMP. And to ensure that the summary can satisfy the different needs, it should be written and presented clearly using a plain language approach. I mean, like, there can be some technical terms because sometimes they cannot be avoided. But then, as far as possible, this has to be mentioned clearly in a plain language, and the document should clearly explain its purpose and how it relates to other information, in particular the product information. So there are different annexes to the RMP. In the interest of time, I'll not go into the details of these different annexes, as we have the next topic on REMS, which is also very important. So I would now move to that particular part. And before Mugdha explains about the REMS from the US perspective, I'll give her a brief introduction. Dr. Mugdha Chopra is the co-founder and director of Evinsa Life Sciences, and she has more than 16 years of experience in the field of pharmacovigilance and clinical research. She was the associate VP for USPV and clinical safety at APSR in her last assignment, and she was overseeing the delivery and operations from India, which included but not limited to case processing or signaling or literature and aggregate reports. Before joining APSR, she was with Ranbaxy as the manager in the Department of Medical Affairs and Pharmacovigilance. She comes with an extensive experience in various safety databases like Argus, LSG, and she was involved in different kind of activities, including the reporting, case processing, and product license management. And she has met challenges in business continuity planning and data restoration. So this is for Mugdha. So over to Mugdha. You can begin your session on REMS.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sanjeev, for the presentation on the risk management plans and for the nice introduction. So before I start my presentation about REMS, I would just like to emphasize on one point that whether it is risk management plan in Europe or the REMS in the US, the basic principle will always remain the same. Though there might be some differences in the way the risk management is carried out across Europe or the US, or for that matter, any part of the globe. The basic idea is to ensure that the benefit of any drug outweighs its risks, and regulatory authorities ensure that this happens. And accordingly, pharmaceutical companies are required to implement the risk minimization measures. Prior to 2007, FDA occasionally asked companies to develop special safety programs called risk management programs or risk minimization action plans, risk maps, to mitigate serious risks for a limited number of drug products that offered substantial therapeutic benefits. In 2007, through the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act, FDA received the explicit authority to require a REMS when necessary to ensure the benefits outweigh the risks of a drug. At FDA, risk management is a key consideration in assessing the benefit-risk balance of a drug. Risk management involves assessing a drug's benefit-risk balance, developing and implementing tools to minimize the risks while preserving the benefits, evaluating the effectiveness of such tools and reassessing their benefit-risk balance, and lastly, making adjustments to risk minimization tools to further improve the risk-benefit balance. So the primary goal for REMS is also patient safety and ensuring that the benefits outweigh the risks. Now let me give some examples of risks where REMS is required. For example, if there is a risk of a serious infection from a particular drug, there would certainly be a requirement of patient education of initial warning signs of infection prior to prescription. Similarly, for drugs having serious allergic reactions, healthcare professionals must always be certified to administer the product. In case of drugs causing hepatotoxicity, liver function monitoring is actually essential to be done before prescribing that drug. Again, for any drug like isotretinoin, which has the potential to cause teratogenicity, negative UPT or urine pregnancy test is mandatory prior to dispensing that particular drug to the patients. Where all REMS is required by the US FDA. Just to highlight one point here, that not every product requires REMS in the US. So REMS can be required both before approval and after approval. If FDA determines REMS is necessary to ensure that the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks, this will be required to be in place before approval as well. Similarly, after the approval of a drug, if FDA becomes aware of new safety information and determines that a REMS is necessary to ensure that the benefits of the drugs are outweighing the risks, REMS will be required to be implemented even after approval of the drug. FDA can require a REMS for prescription drugs and biologics if the FDA determines it is necessary to ensure that the benefits of the medications are outweighing the risks. And FDA can also require a REMS for generic prescription medications. So it is not that generic prescription medicines would not need REMS. They would need REMS, but there would be different requirements. But REMS do not apply to over-the-counter medications. So without a REMS, these medications would not be approved or would be withdrawn from the market because of known or potential serious risks associated with the medication. So FDA's primary risk management tool is communicating through FDA-approved product labeling, which is called prescribing information, which includes a summary of the essential information needed by the healthcare providers for the safe and effective use of the drug. Labeling is sufficient for most drugs to ensure that the benefits are outweighing the risks, but in a limited number of cases, FDA may determine that a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy or REMS will also be needed to help ensure that the benefits of drugs are outweighing the risks. These are some of the examples where FDA requires REMS at the time of the NDA submission. So I'll not be enumerating all of these names, but we can see that these are the products which have the potential of some serious risks like hepatotoxicity or allergic reaction, but the benefits outweigh the risks, and applicants need to have a REMS in place to mitigate these kind of serious risks before at the time of the NDA submission. Similarly, when a drug is approved, the safety data for that drug becomes larger and larger. And post-approval, if the FDA determines that there is a new safety information coming out for the product, the REMS will be required to be in place. For example, TNF blockers, they were seen to have a risk of fungal infection, or fluoroquinolones were seen to have risks of tendinitis and tendon rupture. In such situations, FDA may ask pharmaceutical companies to implement REMS to ensure that the risks can be minimized for these drugs and mitigation measures are in place for these drugs. There are many factors which determine the need of having REMS in place. The requirement of REMS for a drug depends not only on the expected benefits and adverse effects of the drug, but also takes into consideration other issues like size of the population, seriousness of the disease, and expected duration of the treatment too. Besides all the things we were just talking about, there are just a few key points which need to be emphasized. So each REMS has certain unique safety measures which need to be adhered to by the healthcare professionals and distributors prior to prescribing, shipping, or dispensing the drug. FDA can require a REMS if the FDA determines that safety measures are needed beyond the professional labeling to ensure that a drug's benefits outweigh the risks. And an applicant may also voluntarily submit a proposed REMS without having been required to do so by the FDA. Drug sponsors, they develop REMS programs, and FDA reviews and approves them. FDA can require a REMS before or even after the drug is approved, as we were talking earlier, that FDA may require REMS before approval also, and for certain drugs after approval also, depending on the safety of that particular drug. REMS can be required for a single drug or a class of drugs, and each REMS has specific safety measures unique to the safety risk associated with a particular drug or class of drugs, which means that no two REMS are exactly alike. By and large, there are some common stakeholders for REMS: the manufacturers, prescribers, patients, and pharmacies. So thus the requisites and implementation of REMS affects not only the patients and the prescribers, they also affect the manufacturers and the pharmacies too. Let me now take an example of a REMS program, which is the iPledge program, which is running for a long time now. So many of you would be knowing that the drug isotretinoin, which Sanjeev was also referring to in his presentation, which is used for treatment of acne, but it has some serious risks of teratogenicity and some psychiatric events. FDA requested REMS to be implemented by the companies who are the applicant holders for isotretinoin. In this iPledge program, there are certain mandatory requirements for all the stakeholders. Pharmacists have to register with iPledge. They have to meet all other iPledge requirements, like they have to authorize all prescriptions through iPledge. They cannot dispense more than a 30-day supply of isotretinoin, and medication guide has to be given with the product to the patients. Similarly, if we talk about wholesalers also have to register with the iPledge program, and they can ship only to the pharmacies which are licensed in the US and registered and activated in iPledge. For physicians, they not only have to register, but they have certain crucial responsibilities of counseling all isotretinoin patients as required by the iPledge. They also can only prescribe 30-day supply of isotretinoin. And as the drug has the potential of teratogenicity, prescribers must get the pregnancy test or the urine pregnancy test done and ensure that it is negative before they prescribe isotretinoin to their patients. Now, for patients, only patients who are registered by the prescribers will be getting the product. Female patients of childbearing potential, they must enter required information regarding contraception, regarding negative pregnancy before getting qualified for getting the prescription for isotretinoin by the physicians. There are some key elements of REMS which I'll be talking in detail in my next slide. So at the end of the day, the basic objective is to have effective risk mitigation measures to ensure that the benefits are outweighing the risks. REMS requires a meticulous plan beginning from medication guide, an effective communication and implementation plan, elements to assure safe use, which is a TASU, and a systematic procedure for submission of assessments. Now, beginning with the medication guide. Medication guide is required if the drug product is the one for which patient labeling could help prevent serious adverse effects. If the drug has a serious risk, the patient should be made aware, and these could be avoided by educating the patient about the same. This may influence the patient adherence to the product or patient's decision to use or not to use the product. So medication guide is very important to health and patient adherence to directions for use and is crucial for to the drug's effectiveness too. Now, it goes without saying that it should be in a comprehensible format and language that is written in a non-technical language which is easily understood by the patients so they can understand and have a standardized, it should have a standardized format with regard to the font size and headers. Medication guide should be dispensed with the drug, and medication guide is provided in addition to the general information sheets like the consumer medication information. So some of the examples of REMS with medication guide is one of the drug called Xarelto, which is rivaroxaban. So the goal of the REMS is to inform non-valvular atrial fibrillation patients that Xarelto should not be stopped without first informing their healthcare professional or provider to minimize the risk of post-discontinuation thrombotic events. Similarly, Androgel, which is testosterone gel, it clearly informs, the medication guide informs the patients about the serious risks associated with the use of Androgel. Now comes the communication plan. An effective communication plan is developed by the drug sponsor to support the implementation of an element of REMS and can inform the key audiences like the healthcare providers about the risks of the drug. The communication plan could include sending letters to the healthcare providers. For example, in opioid REMS, letters are sent to healthcare professionals. And this can also include disseminating information about the REMS through professional societies, about any serious risks of the drug, and any measures to assure safe use. For example, the information regarding a neurology drug can be disseminated through some neurological societies or so that their targeted physicians are aware of the serious risks and they know the means to mitigate them. A communication plan should educate, inform, and should raise awareness of the risks. To take an example of a REMS having a communication plan, there is a drug called Gilenya, which is fingolimod, which is indicated for the treatment of patients with relapsing forms of multiple sclerosis. The goal of the REMS is to ensure healthcare professionals about the risks of the drug, like bradyarrhythmia and atrioventricular block, or infections, macular edema, and posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. Another example of REMS having a communication plan is azogabine, which is a drug to treat partial onset seizures. And the goal of the REMS is to inform the healthcare professionals of the risk of urinary retention and symptoms of acute urinary retention in patients taking the drug. Coming to ITASU, the most important element of REMS is ITASU, which is elements to assure safe use. In many REMS, medication guides are sufficient. However, for some, ITASU are required. It applies to the drugs which are very effective, but have a serious adverse event tagged along which needs to be addressed before prescribing the drug. ITASU are required medical interventions or other actions healthcare professionals need to execute prior to prescribing or dispensing the drug to the patient. So the ITASU requirements are intended to reduce a specific serious risk listed in the labeling of the drug. As a particular serious adverse event is being targeted, so REMS may require one of the following things which are mentioned below in this slide. So prescribers may be required to have specific training or experience or special certification, or may be allowed to dispense the drug in certain healthcare settings only or with evidence of safe use conditions. At the receiving end, the patient may be subjected to registration or rigorous monitoring. So some examples of REMS with ITASU, there is a drug called vendetanib to treat medullary thyroid cancer. In this REMS, the goal is to educate prescribers and inform patients of the drug's risks of abnormal heart rhythms like QT prolongation or torsades de pointes that can cause sudden death. So the prescribers must be trained and both prescribers and pharmacies must be specially certified. Similarly, for a drug called natalizumab, which is used to treat multiple sclerosis and Crohn's disease. The goal of this REMS is to inform prescribers, the infusion center healthcare providers, and patients about the risk for progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy. Planning is good, but implementation will be successful, undoubtedly ensuring compliance to ITASU, which plays a pivotal role in REMS. So if a REMS includes certain ITASU measures, the sponsor is expected to take reasonable steps to monitor and evaluate implementation of measures by healthcare providers, pharmacists, and other parties in the healthcare system who are responsible for implementing those elements so that the implementation of the elements can be improved. It can be achieved by maintaining a validated and secure database of all certified entities like pharmacies or practitioners or and the healthcare settings to ensure any certification requirements, periodic audits of pharmacies, practitioners, and healthcare settings, and on a larger scale audit of distribution systems to determine that the drug is only being distributed to the authorized entities. Practically, if we know regarding the stakeholders, appropriate implementation and assessment of the REMS program needs to be carried out. So while we were talking about implementation, it is very important that the sponsor prepares the assessment reports and reports to the FDA at a periodic interval. These assessments must be done by the sponsors to assess how well the REMS program is working and report back to the FDA. All REMS for NDAs and BLAs must include a timetable for assessing the effectiveness of their safety measures. And generally, the assessment must be at least done by 18 months or 3 years, and the 7th years after the REMS is approved. And this is not fixed time interval for assessment. It all depends on the seriousness of the risks. For some REMS, the sponsors are required to share the assessment reports at a more frequent basis too. And assessment results may be used to modify the REMS or even eliminate it if the assessment shows that the changes are needed or that REMS has met its goal. If we talk about some examples where REMS was modified after assessment, so there is a drug called embricenten, a drug used to treat high blood pressure in the lungs, and the requirement for liver function testing was removed from REMS after assessment. And similarly, for another drug, Promacta, which is a drug used to treat low blood platelets, the requirement for prescriber or patient and pharmacy enrollment was removed after the REMS assessment. So what kind of information is provided in the assessments? Generally, it can differ depending upon the risks being evaluated, but the assessments, they generally include survey data from the healthcare professionals' understanding regarding the safe use of the drug as measured through surveys, summary of adverse events associated with the drugs that REMS was designed to address. The assessment should also include the prescriber compliance, which is the completing the training and enrollment procedures, or completing patient baseline form, or complying with the discontinuation procedures. And assessment plan should also include the use data, what patients are getting the drug and under what conditions of use, and the number and percentages of patients who were monitored for potential serious adverse events during treatment with the drug. I'll now take an example of a very common REMS, and a couple of next slides are talking about the REMS for extended release or long-acting opioids. All the above mentioned strategies, what we discussed, they are all these are actually described in a very crisp manner in the REMS for opioids. So opioids are potent pain-relieving medicines, primarily use management of persistent moderate to severe pain requiring round-the-clock opioid analgesics for an extended period. And opioids are widely prescribed, and there is definitely a risk of abuse, misuse, and death. So the alarming rate of abuse, misuse, and death undoubtedly steers on the need for having an effective REMS for opioids. REMS are only required for the extended release or long-acting opioids, as the longer duration of action because of the extended release of the drugs in these preparation poses a disproportionate safety problem associated with these products if they are used irrationally. Further, the healthcare professionals need to be sensitized to the adverse events with these drugs. Objective of REMS for extended release and long-acting opioid analgesics is to alert the healthcare professionals and patients about the importance of proper prescribing and the safe and proper use of the extended release or long-acting opioid analgesics medications. To explain the responsibility that manufacturers of these products must make educational materials available for prescribers and patients, and to encourage, the objective is to encourage prescribers to thoroughly discuss the risks and benefits of these products with their patients. As a part of this REMS, a medication guide is dispensed with each extended release or long-acting opioid analgesic prescription in accordance with 21 CFR 208.24. And medication guides for the long-acting opioids are part of this opioid analgesic REMS program and is available through the opioid analgesic REMS website. There are different components for ITASU for extended release opioids, and the backbone of all these components is training. Training is made available to the healthcare providers who prescribe the extended release or long-acting opioid analgesics. REMS compliant training has to be provided, which includes training provided by the accredited CE providers. Training includes all elements of the FDA blueprint for prescriber education and is subject to independent audit too. The NDA or ANDA holders for these opioid analgesic products have to ensure that REMS compliant training is made available to the prescribers of these drugs, and they will achieve the performance goals. And NDA or ANDA holders have to also ensure that independent audits of the educational materials used by the providers for training are conducted during the REMS. To further ensure that prescribers are aware of the existence of the extended release or long-acting opioid analgesics, so REMS and the prescriber training can be disseminated to the professional organizations too. As a part of the training program, there are some expectations from the prescriber. Prescribers should assess the patients for treatment. They should be fully aware of initiating therapy, modifying dose, and discontinuing the use. They should be able to counsel the patients well and should have the details of the general and specific drug information. Now, with regard to the timetable for submission of assessment for opioid REMS, so REMS assessments will be submitted to the FDA at 6 months and 12 months after the initial approval date of the REMS and annually thereafter. And to facilitate the inclusion of as much information as possible while allowing reasonable time to prepare the submission, the reporting interval covered by each assessment will conclude no earlier than 60 days before the submission date of that assessment. That is all what I have in the presentation today. So floor is now open for the questions. Thank you.
So we've received quite a few good questions. The first one I will address to Magda. What kind of medications require REMS?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sharon. And it is a very good question. And as I explained in the slides too, so FDA can require REMS for the prescription drugs and biologics if FDA determines or if FDA needs to know that it is necessary to ensure that the benefits of the medication are outweighing the risks. So basic intent is to just assess whether and to ensure that the benefit of any medication is outweighing the risk. So FDA can also need REMS for a generic drug. So all drugs, prescription drugs or biologics, they need to have the REMS if FDA asks for it, and even the generic drugs, but there are some different requirements for the generic drugs, but REMS are not required for the OTC drugs per se. So all the prescription biologics, they would need REMS if FDA is asking. Generic drugs also sometimes FDA asks, but it is not required for the OTC drugs. Again, and as I was explaining earlier in my slide, so the REMS can be required both during the pre-approval phase or after the drug is approved.
Okay, thank you so much, Magda. The second question, I think Sanjeev can answer. Do we need to prepare all the sections of an RMP for a biosimilar product?
Sure, Sharon, I can address that. So if you look at the GP module 5, in fact, it clearly mentions the requirement for different kind of applications. And as far as the requirement for a biosimilar product is there, we have to in fact provide all the parts of RMPs, including all the part 2 safety specification modules, except for the epidemiology. That's what the GP module says. And I think there is a logic behind that. Practically, when we are dealing with biosimilar, we are trying to basically have those kind of products which are not similar to generic products, because their manufacturing is different. So the safety concerns could be still different in a biosimilar product. So that's why it is expected for any biosimilar product, all the safety specification module part 2, whether it's section 2 or 3 or section 7, which is the important identified important potential risk, because these could be specific to those biosimilar products. So they have to be documented accordingly in the RMP document. And in fact, like if you look at the GP module 5, it mentions the requirement for all types of application, whether it's a generic product or it's a fixed combination product. The idea is basically that if we are not expecting a new safety concern, like say for an innovative product, we have to anyway provide all the sections, and all the safety specification modules have to be captured in the RMP. But in generic products, they are not required, because we are expecting that their safety concerns would be similar to the innovative one. But for biosimilar, as I mentioned, like since we do expect that the safety concerns could be different, so that's why everything is required except for the epidemiology. So that is waived off for biosimilar.
Thank you, Sanjeev. So for the next question, Magda, does FDA also develop the REMS?
Sure, Sharon, I can address this question. So FDA is the main party or responsible stakeholder who determines that a REMS is actually required or not, if REMS is necessary for that product. So it specifies the requirement, it approves the REMS, but FDA itself is not the one who will develop REMS. So manufacturers of the drugs are the ones who are responsible for developing the REMS, implementing the REMS, and then FDA sees after the assessment plans what are the goals being met. So they are actually reviewing and approving, and the assessment plans too. But FDA itself would not be preparing or developing the REMS. So some of the manufacturers, because they have to develop and implement the REMS, sometimes they do it in house, sometimes they even outsource these responsibilities to a CRO who actually does that on their behalf. So in a nutshell, it is the manufacturers of the drugs who are actually required to prepare, develop and implement REMS, and not the FDA.
Okay, thank you, Magda. And the next one, I think you can answer as well. Are the REMS assessments to be done lifelong?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Sharon. So I can answer that. So REMS assessment, as per the guidance document, so REMS assessment has to be done on a periodic basis. It has to be 18 months, 2 years, 7 years after the REMS is approved. But then it is not that it has to be done lifelong. REMS assessment report, which is prepared, and if if after FDA reviews the report and it is completing its goals, and it is they just review that if the goals are being met, or the assessment plan needs to be modified accordingly, they will notify the manufacturers to do an update in the REMS or the mitigation strategies. So in case, and I was giving some examples wherein the goal was met and the REMS was even removed, some requirements in the REMS were removed. So it is not that the REMS assessment has to be done lifelong. It is always dependent on FDA. In case FDA says that it is not required to be done more or in future, so we can just the assessments can be stopped at that time.
Okay, thank you, Magda. So I think the last two questions are for Sanjeev. First, are RMPs available in the public domain? And then the last question is RMP required if some product is in the clinical trial phase?
Sure, Sharon. So I can address both of them. Yeah, so as far as the first question is concerned, whether the Part 6, I mean, like the RMP is available in the public domain. So practically, of course, the entire RMP cannot be published in the public domain by the regulatory authorities when the MHs are sending them. It's practically Part 6, which is the summary of the risk management plan, which is there in the public domain, because it's basically, as I mentioned in my presentation, that it's a summary of the risk management plan, which is which is to be captured in a plain language approach. As far as possible, the technical terms have to be avoided. So that is a kind of a part of the RMP that is there in the public domain. So the way it happens is then that anyway, this part is required in all the applications, whether it's an innovator product or it's a generic or a biosimilar. Part 6 is always a part of the RMP. And based on the information which is contained in the Part 6 of the RMP, for the centralized authorized product, the agency should publish that RMP on the EMA website. And for the nationally authorized medicinal product, the summary of the RMP is practically published on the national competent authorities websites. And I think the last question that you mentioned was probably, can you repeat the last question, Sharon? What was that?
Yeah, sorry, Sanjeev. Is an RMP required if some product is in the clinical trial phase?
Sure. So the RMP typically is required to be submitted to the regulatory authorities at the time of marketing approval. So say if a company has done all the clinical trials, so they have to submit the dossier including the RMP for the marketing approval of a product. And generally during the clinical trial, there is no mandatory requirement to prepare any RMP, though there is a term called development RMP, which companies can have in place, where they can document all the safety specifications and important identified and important potential risks. But that's just for the record. During the clinical trial, the pharmaceutical companies in Europe or in most of the other countries, they are not supposed to submit any development RMP to the regulatory authorities, though they can always monitor the safety concerns. They can document that in a development RMP. So this term is already there, which is applicable, but the submission is only required to be done to the regulatory authorities in Europe at the time of marketing approval. So that has to be part of the dossier.
Okay, thank you very much, Sanjeev. And with that, we'll end the webinar. And again, just to remind you, this will be downloaded and on demand after a couple days. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar. See you soon. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.